Hi everybody, welcome to our free fishing seminar here at Lake of the Ozarks. I'm John Nipperadney. I used to do a similar seminar like this with St. Louis County Parks, but they discontinued it. So I decided let's try it down here, and I teamed up with Bass and Bob, and we're putting these together now and having local pros come in and talk to you about all the fishing going on here at the lake. What I do for a living is I'm a freelance fishing writer. I've been doing it for 25 years or so. And in that time, I've written 2 books, one on fishing Lake of the Ozarks, which we sell here at the seminar for $5. And this one is 101 bass fishing tips with the top pros from the MLF circuit and BASS and FLW Tour. And this one's for $12. And my partner here is Bass and Bob, and I'll let him explain his programs.
As I always tell everybody, I always still refer to this book, the Lake of the Ozarks Fishing Guide. It was written, several years ago, but everything's still very, very relevant. And if you're in the fishing business at all, or fishing industry, and you haven't heard of John Nipperadney, most people have. He writes for everybody, including bass. So thank you, John. Hey, thank you all for joining our seminar tonight. Thank you all for coming in attendance personally. Really appreciate it very much. A couple of things regarding Bass and Bob is, one, we have our new Fishing News magazine. So this is the actual physical magazine, but we don't have those out on racks because of the COVID thing. We really didn't want to, put them out there and all that kind of stuff. And there was a little bit of trouble getting things printed. People not open. So you can actually, where's that other one, Steve? So you can actually go online and actually download the Fishing News magazine. So it's out there available. It's free to everybody, right, Steve? Free to everybody. So if you're used to seeing the fishing magazine in the print format, you can go download it from bassandbob.com for free. Load it with really, really great content. Also, I wanted to mention that some of you may have seen this already on the website. So we have launched our new Bass and Bob business called Fish Intel. It's fish-intel. You can go to fishintel.com, fish-intel.com to find out more about it. So basically, we've had a lot of demand from anglers around the country that have come to Lake of the Ozarks and said, man, we wish we had something like this for our lake. And so I basically have taken the Bass and Bob platform and licensing that software platform for individuals or entities around the country that would like to actually execute their own business plan. They can name it whatever they want. They can license it from us. The platform's all ready to go. Basically just sign up with us and they can start making money fishing in the same way we do, through memberships and through advertising, as well as providing really great valuable information to anglers that might fish your lake. And so I also offer, so if any of you know anybody at some other lakes that might be interested, I offer a $500 referral fee. So if you refer somebody to Fish and Tell and they end up licensing the platform from me, I'll pay you $500. We currently went through our beta testing and everything went great. So right now we have Eric Prey at Table Rock Lake. It's called Table Rock Lake Fishingintel.com. So you can get all the same information, same look and feel as Bass and Bob at Table Rock. We're very, very close to executing for Truman Lake, and I have interest from Beaver Lake and several others, and we really haven't even turned on the marketing yet. So check out fishintel.com, and you can learn more about that, or give me a call, or shoot me an email. Fish and Tell is also very proud to sponsor Casey Scanlon. So Casey is one of Fish and Tell sponsors. He's out there around the country fishing all the time, knows lots of people in the industry. Great brand recognition for Fish and Tell around the country with Casey, since he's such a great fisherman and everybody knows him. Casey is our guest pro tonight. We're very happy for that. Casey fishes the FLW Pro Tour. He has fished bass, the Bass Pro Tour. He has fished Major League Fishing. He's won tons of tournaments. His resume is too long for me to list. He's also a local fishing guide here at Lake of the Ozarks. So if you actually want to have a pro fisherman, a national pro, go on a guide trip. He has his guiding business here, and he also has designed his own set of baits. It's called
Trophy Bass Company.
Trophy Bass Company, TBC, Trophy Bass Company. And they work. I've used them, they work. They work on Lake of the Ozarks, they work everywhere. So Casey's our guest tonight, so Casey, next week, stay tuned. We have an up and coming young fisherman, Andy Newcomb. You probably see his name a lot in some tournament results and that type of thing. He won last year's Missouri Invitational Fishing and Golf Championship at Old Kinderhook, and he'll be with us next week. So we have a great lineup for you all summer long. So Casey, tell us what's going on with Lake of the Ozarks and kind of how you're out there catching them right now, how you're getting some of your customers on them, in addition to if you were tournament fishing, how would you fish it? So it's kind of two different things. How are you getting your customers catching fish that may not be, you know, as good as some of these guys that are here at the seminar today, you know, in terms of fishing, and then how you would go about tournament fishing this time of the year on Lake of the Ozarks.
Well, I appreciate it, Bob. Yeah, we'll get through all of that. You know, right now is one of my favorite times of the year to fish. You can pretty much do whatever you want to do. You can fish shallow, you can fish deep. You know, the fish are biting a variety of lures. You know, looking in the tackle box of my boat, all my storage compartments are filled with way too much tackle right now. It's just a fun time of year to get out there and experiment with different lures. Me and John went out and threw some new stuff the other day and had some success. So it's a great time to go out and practice doing a variety of things. So, you know, on the guide trips, we've been fishing shallow and deep. It really just depends on kind of the conditions and you know, what part of the lake we're dealing with. You know, we had Vern up here earlier talking about, you know, the fish have had a late spawn, and you know, that's definitely true. There's probably still some fish spawning, and you know, this is a big lake, so not all the fish can rush to the bank at once and have room to get up there and spawn. So it kind of has a trickle effect every year. You know, I mean, we get several different waves of fish that come in, and you know, I know when we had our first real big wave of fish come up, you know, gosh, I think the water temperature was in the 60s for over a month and just kind of never changed. So there was a lot of fish that were coming and going, and we had a lot of post-spawn fish real early in the year. I think we had a real early wave of fish come in and spawn, and you know, they're still spawning. So you can get up there and fish behind the docks. You know, there's a lot of bluegill beds right now, which provides some really good topwater fishing. You know, they really like a finesse worm, a wacky rigged Cinco type bait. I usually use like the Bass Pro Sticko, but just any kind of, you know, straight tail worm is good around those beds. A popar, a spook, any kind of a topwater is really good, and it's a really fun way to fish. It's very visible fishing. You'll go back there, and usually bluegill beds are you know, in the back ends of coves and creeks and things like that, and you'll see them. It'll look like, you know, craters on the moon. It'll be a lot of little dark spots, and oftentimes you'll see the bluegill, but there'll be a lot of them clustered together. And usually just throw a topwater over it a few times, you know, and find out if it's an active bed. If you see bluegills on it, you know, it means it's an active bed, and that's, you know, much better. But those bass will hang around and kind of make sure the bluegills, you know, stay in line, and whenever they get kind of active and kind of move away from that bed, you know, the bass will react and grab one of them. So usually a few hanging around those. We've been targeting the brim beds when we're around them. You know, top water in the morning has been really fun. You can fish it around main lake points. And we've had a lot of rain, so that means there's a lot of current from dam to dam. So that provides a lot of good fishing, and these fish are going to set up, you know, in current break areas. You know, points, secondary points are all prime locations. So when we're fishing out deep, you know, those are kind of the areas we're targeting. You know, those fish are going to set up. If you're used to a river system, they're going to set up just out of that current. So they're going to use the drop-offs, rock piles, brush piles. You know, they'll get on the inside of points and things like that, just out of the current a lot of times. And some of the more active fish will be right up on top or on that leading edge where the current you know, hits a point. So always be mindful, you know, when they're running water, of, you know, which way the current's flowing and where it's going to hit these different objects, because it's going to help, you know, position those fish. And usually, you know, when you find an area where they're current related, you know, you're going to catch more than one fish. So kind of keep a line up on the bank of where your cast was directed when you got that bite, and always make multiple casts. So, but you know, we should have had a shad spawn as well going on, and I didn't really notice it very much this year. The water temp jumped up from that 60 degrees to 80 degrees really fast, and normally a shad spawn will happen you know, somewhere in the low 70s, you know, right when the bass finish up spawning. A lot of times you know, you'll see that shad spawn going on real early in the morning. So we've seen a little bit of it. Usually floating boat docks are a great area to target, but the shad will spawn pretty much anywhere. So what you really want to do is look for birds more than anything, and getting out early in the morning is also real key, because once the sun gets up bright, those shad will stop spawning. And sometimes it'll continue on, you know, later into the day, but they don't really spawn during daylight hours. They try to do it overnight and in low light conditions, because, you know, the predators will take advantage of them if they're spawning during the daylight. I mean, it'd be a feeding frenzy and they'd clean up on those shad. So they try to do it in low light hours. You know, when you get a cloudy day, you know, that bite will extend further in the day. So what I like to do is throw something like, you know, you can throw a swim bait, you can throw a swim jig, which is really good around the boat docks, you know, because you can slide it up in there and fish it pretty aggressively. You can even pair these two up, and it makes a pretty good combo. And a spinner bait is also real good. These are both our Trophy Bass Company products here, but what you want to look for is the shad actually following your bait. So you're throwing a bait to mimic the shad, and then spinner bait's a great example. When you're reeling this, the shad will actually try to spawn with the bait. So when they're spawning, they're rubbing up against each other. So you'll actually feel them hitting the blades of your spinner bait. And that's when you can actually tell that you're around a shad spawn. So the key is to really get out there early. You want to get out there early, do some driving around, and just be on the lookout. If you see 3 or 4 birds in an area, there's a good chance that there's something going on over there. And so then I'll go over in that area and you know, start throwing a moving bait around, something white, usually in color, that replicates those shad. Usually, like this spinnerbait has a lot of chartreuse in it, but we make one with you know, white blades and all white skirt. So that would probably be, you know, what I would select first. You know, something like that, and that'll really let you know that the shad are spawning. From then you can you know, kind of experiment with baits. But marina docks are a great place to look. You know, even wave breaks, things like that. They really like that floating structure, and they'll just hang right underneath it a lot of times. You know, points are great places. They'll spawn on, you know, sawdust and things like that in the backs of these little coves and creeks. I mean, really, you know, a lot of different objects, you know, they'll choose to spawn around. The real key is just finding where they're at, and then finding where the bass are feeding on them. A lot of times you'll find the shad spawning and the bass may have not found them yet. You know, I see it a lot in situations where, you know, some of the bass may be still spawning. You know, they're preoccupied with spawning, and that shad spawn's going on right next to them. They kind of ignore it. So, you know, you might find 3 or 4 different shad spawns in the morning, and one of them might have some fish around it. So that's something we're always on the lookout. We found a few of them, and when you find it, it's super fun. I mean, you catch them really quick, and you know, usually, you know, when you set the boat down, you'll see birds and the shad activity, and a lot of times you'll see the shad, you know, actually flipping up on the bank, or, you know, running up against the boat dock, things like that. So you know, it's a really exciting way to fish. Usually it's real visible strikes. So we found that a few of the mornings. That's really starting to kind of fade away, and now the fish are starting to kind of progress out deeper. Still a lot of them shallow. So in the morning or in the afternoons when the boat traffic's real heavy, you know, we'll kind of slide back in there, you know, and fish some of those shallow bays, you know, where we're using, you know, a jig is usually always on my deck. So back there we're using like a 1/2 ounce jig, a 3/8 ounce finesse jig, something like that. Shaky head's always a really good bet. You know, for fishing less than 10 feet, I'm going to say, you know, 1/4 ounce, 5/16, something like that. And just fish it around any kind of visible cover, boat docks. You know, behind the boat docks is real key a lot of times, because, we still have some fish spawning. They're finishing up the spawn, and I've seen a lot of fish. This is also starting to fade a little bit, but I've seen a lot of fish guarding fry. So you'll actually visibly see the fish a lot of times, and they're sometimes under the floats, they're sometimes under that back corner, but usually the fry tries to get around shade. They try to kind of stay in shaded areas, whether it's an overhanging tree or underneath the boat dock or a float, something like that. But usually they're around shade. You can usually see that bass somewhere in the proximity of them, and they're really just little black specks is what they look like. They're not really going to look like minnows. They're not really going to look like fish. They're going to be just little black dots, and they'll be in a ball about that big typically. And usually, if you throw right at that ball of fry, that fish will, if he's there, will show himself, and he'll eat whatever bait you throw. Typically, a wacky rig is a really good option. It sinks slow. And we've been catching a lot of fish on that this year. So, and the wacky rig's pretty awesome, especially on our guide trips. You can use it on a spinning rod, which a lot of my customers prefer that are new to fishing. And it's a great way to learn how to skip these cables. Even if you throw a bait caster or but haven't done a whole lot of skipping, it's a great way to practice the motion of getting it under the cables. And on this lake, and all lakes, those fish try to get tucked away. They can feel fishing pressure, and this lake is no exception. They love getting behind the boat docks. They feel protected back there at a lot of different times a year. So we've been doing a lot of that, practicing skipping behind the cables with the weightless Senko. It skips really well. You can use that spinning rod, and once you get that motion down, it makes using a bait caster much easier, because it's still the same kind of basic presentation where you're keeping your bait low to the ground. You try to skip that bait just in front of where you want it to go under. So if I have a cable right here, I'm going to try to make that first skip right before that cable. A lot of times we try to make it too far back to the boat, where you get a big high jump on that first one and it gets up in the air and goes over the cable or whatever you're trying to aim at. So I try to just look at where I want it to hit. I feel like if you stare at where you want it to hit and think about less of what it's doing, I'll have a lot more success. So I'll just kind of keep my eye focused on where I want it to land, and just let my my body do the work. And once you get those mechanics down, it'll start becoming easier and easier. But usually you want it to land closer to your target than you originally anticipate. When you get it right there, you can get that extra trajectory, and you keep it real low to the ground, and kind of raise your rod tip up as you make that first skip, and it'll kind of get some momentum for it to kind of keep off of the water instead of burying down into the water. So we've been doing that a lot, been real successful with that. And we do it in the afternoon when we get some good shade back in the coves. And we'll do it first thing in the morning. We'll fish some top waters back in some of these coves, and fish for some of those fish that have finished up spawning, maybe some resident fish. There's always going to be some fish that stay in a lot of these bigger creeks. And we've had a lot of rain and runoff and high water where it keeps those fish up shallow. So we've just had a lot of fish up shallow in general, and we've been sliding out a little bit deeper as the summer's progressing now, and they're starting to get out there off the bank. We've been fishing a little bit at night. Seems like as usual they suck up to brush piles at night. And that bite's getting better and better, and it's going to get better as the summer wears on. And typically gets really good, when they kind of cut this current off. So right now, Truman Lake's got some high water, so they're dumping water out of Truman. I was actually on Truman Lake today, and they were flushing it pretty good. There's a lot of visible current coming around trees and things like that. So they're dumping it pretty hard, which makes that lower Osage, upper Osage River really, really fun. So it's a place that I kind of grew up fishing, and here living on the lower end of the lake, it's kind of a journey to get down there and fish. But when they're running current out of Truman, it can be really, really fun. Haven't been down there lately, but if you guys get a chance, go try it. And it'll give you a really good idea of how just fish position in general in current. You're going to see visible eddies down there. You're going to have a lot of main river laydowns, things like that. And the fish are going to be shallow. They stay shallow down there. and they're going to get on those current breaks. So you'll visibly see those current breaks, back eddies and things like that. It's going to fish like a river system in this spinner bait, around laydowns, in the slack water right behind these eddies. So eddies will form around points, turns in the river channel, and what it is where that rushing water is coming around a corner, meeting an object, maybe an underwater point, or just maybe some slack water, and it just creates a little pool of slack water there where the bait fish are going to gather up, and where those bass are able to position and kind of stay out of that current and wait for the prey to come by and ambush them. So a lot of times you'll get big schools in those kind of situations, and the spinnerbait up there being so shallow and being that it's running water and it's pretty swift sometimes is a really good option, especially on that main river. Really fun way to fish. I encourage you guys to go try that if you get a chance. It's just it's a little bit different than this lower end, and super fun. So a lot of laydowns on the main river.
What ounce spinnerbait would you throw up there?
What's that?
What ounce spinnerbait would you throw up there?
Typically the heavier the current, the heavier the bait. So I'm gonna start off with probably a 3/4 ounce spinnerbait in the current. And you're gonna want to throw up current and let that bait kind of wash underneath, come real natural with the current. So whichever the way the current's flowing is the way that bait needs to be presented. So it needs to come with the current a lot of times. Now in real swift water, a lot of times you don't have an option, and you just kind of, your trolling motor can't really hold in some of that. So you just kind of go surfing and go with the current, and try to make as many. You're almost making a back cast, and a lot of those fish will position. There'll be an eddy on almost every object on the main river, and it might just be really small. So if you got a tree right there blocking the current, there's going to be really swift current on the end of that tree. But right next to the bank there by the trunk is usually just a little eddy of slack water, and that's where that fish is going to position. They're going to try to stay out of that really swift current. Now if it's a slight current out of there, they're not generating a lot of water, those fish will tend to kind of gravitate more towards the ends of the laydowns and things like that. But you're fishing, the mouths of creeks, turns in the river, islands, points, anything that kind of is going to block the current up there. And you're basically going to use a jig, some kind of a flipping bait, whether it's a beaver, a creature bait, shaky head, and then square bill. Some of those deeper eddies and things like that, you can probably get away with, a medium diving crankbait, something like that. But the spinnerbait's a fun way to fish, cover water, and it's going to catch those really aggressive fish, that are up there ready to eat. So that's a really fun way to fish this time of year, especially when they got current rolling up there. That's the best time to go. But on this lower end here, we're starting to slide out deeper, brush piles. Points, secondary points, they're primary targets. A lot of those fish are working their way out of the pockets and coming out to the main river, or maybe some main points within the creeks and things like that. So what I want to do is just kind of, when I go back into these creeks, I kind of try to work myself out. So I'll go in there and I'll look around and kind of visibly tell myself, where did these fish spawn? And then I kind of try to track their movement out. So, they're going to spawn back in a bay, they're going to move out to that first available point, and then, maybe hit a channel bank and kind of go out to the next point, out to the main river eventually. So I'm going to try to track their movements, and somewhere in there, you'll kind of run into them. Bluffs are really good right now, bluffs in the creeks, bluffs out on the main lake. They're running a lot of current. So that current's going to wash down those bluffs just like it would, when it was the old river channel. It's going to wash right down those bluffs. And so any irregularity, any big rocks are going to create a current break that those fish are going to get behind. So, that's a real good target. But I'm using my Garmin's to basically go out and find a lot of these fish, doing a lot of idling around. So I'll idle around out there, depending on the area of the lake I'm fishing. If you're up there, I'm going to say mid-lake, which to me is 50 to you know, 30-mile marker somewhere in there. You know, those fish tend to be a little shallower. You know, so I'm going to look more in that, you know, 8 to 15, 8 to 20 foot. You know, whereas on the lower end of the lake, you know, some of those fish can get out, you know, 30+ foot of water sometimes. But generally speaking, you know, that 12 to 20 foot depth range is a really good range to set your boat in and do some idling around and looking for the fish. Looking for fish on the bottom. Those are typically feeding fish. Now I'm observant of what's up in the water column as well, you know, whether it's white bass, you know, the presence of bait fish. You know, you always want to see bait fish and activity in an area. The presence of white bass, you know, is often a good thing because they're there feeding on the bait as well. So you want to see some activity on your graph, and you want to see fish on the bottom generally. You know, when I see fish on the bottom that aren't really grouped up, you know, I want to see 1 or 2, 3, 4. You know, I want to be able to kind of count the dots across my screen as opposed to seeing a big giant cluster of them, because usually those aren't bass. You know, if I see a few on the bottom, I can pretty much call those bass on this lake. So if they're in that, you know, 12 to 25 depth range and they're sitting on the bottom and there's several of them there, you know, I'm going to put a mark on those fish. I'm going to turn around and I'm going to try to throw my bait directly into those fish. And so that's a great way to fish. You know, and those fish are post-spawn, they're tired, they're deep. So if you are catching them, I encourage you to, you know, put them right back if you're not in the tournament. You know, take a quick picture, put them back. You know, and that's the shallow fish too. You know, we're catching a lot of them and putting them in the boat and they're dripping blood off of their tail. You know, I mean, so they are, you know, fresh off the spawn, they're tired. So a lot of big ones out there, but you know, definitely if you're putting them in the live well, keep care of them. You know, put some juice on them and keep the live wells running constantly. Ice is always a good thing. And then, you know, if you're out fun fishing, take a quick photo and put them back because, you know, those big fish are hard to come by sometimes. So it's always fun catching them. And right now they're feeding, and that's why it makes this one of the best times of the year to fish, is just because, you know, they're out there, they're hungry, they're tired, and they're snapping. So me and John went out the other day. It wasn't awesome, but it was pretty good. You know, you can do kind of whatever you want right now. We had, like I said, I was on Truman today. That was really good, and we fished over the weekend here at the Ozarks in all this rough water, and it was really good over the weekend. So you know, when we're fishing, really my staple a lot of times of the year is just a jig. It's simple, it's effective, and it'll work most of the year. You know, right now, if I'm fishing deeper, I'm going to always select a heavier size. So, you know, I'm fishing deeper than 12 foot. You know, I'm typically using a 5/8, a 3/4, something like that. You know, around boat docks and things like that, I really like a 1/2 ounce. It skips well, and it just has the right fall, and I can adjust the trailer size and the kind of trailer that I'm using to kind of play with that fall rate a little bit more. But the 1/2 ounce is just, it's a really good skipping bait, and you know, has a big hook in it. I can fish it through, I can fish with big line, a big rod, and heavy cover, and you know, really fish it throughout the year. So I'm more focused on, I keep the bait simple, really just focus on experimenting and finding the fish. So, you know, these fish change all the time. That's this lake, that's any lake, and you know, they're on the move right now, and that's the case all the time. It's usually they're swimming after bait fish, but right now they're moving out of these bays, trying to set up. So if we're not catching them somewhere pretty quick, we tend to move pretty quick. This is a good lake with a lot of fish. If we were on the Ohio River and you get 5 bites a day on a good day, you know, you tend to put the trolling motor down, fish slow, you know, maybe not do a whole lot of moving around. You know, you really, you're not getting enough bites to clue you into what the fish are doing. You're just fishing hard. You know, we're on a lake like this where you can get a lot of bites, where you have a lot of fish of all sizes. You know, move around a lot until and change techniques until you start getting the bites. And so usually I keep the baits simple, you know, shaky heads, jigs, you know, crankbaits, spinner baits, and you know, the color selection pretty simple too. I mean, I use a lot of brown, green pumpkin, and that's on plastics and jigs. Black and blue is one of my favorite colors, and that's everywhere I go in the country. You know, I keep a lot of those baits around, you know, so I don't run out, but I don't keep, I don't get real complicated in the shapes. You know, I'll keep creature baits around, like a brush hog style bait, a beaver style bait for when you're fishing tighter to cover. You know, your straight tail worms, your 10-inch worm, you know, so just your traditional shapes, and I'm using a lot of the same colors, you know, green pumpkins, you know, a watermelon occasionally, black and blue, just real standard stuff, and just more focusing on what the fish are doing, what kind of adjustments I need to make in order to be around those fish. So a lot of times it's just getting around them. That's the biggest battle, is getting around them. And we've had to change tactics, you know, a lot of days. So, you know, these sunny days, they position real tight to cover. You know, these cloudy, windy days, they get looser to cover, where, you know, things like crankbaits and stuff like that are a lot better option. You know, they quit running current. It's going to position the fish differently. They're going to tend to suspend. So then we use a little bit lighter baits, get a slower fall rate where those fish will catch it on the way down. Maybe fish more, you know, boat docks and things like that, or cables where the fish tend to suspend around, where, you know, that bait stays in the strike zone longer. So we're constantly trying to make those small adjustments to try to catch the fish. And that's not meaning that, you know, I'm running 20 miles to go, you know, over here and go over there. I mean, you can make real small adjustments in a small area until you figure it out, and then you can start kind of making those bigger moves. But right now, the 1/2 ounce Pro Jig, this is the Trophy Bass Company Pro Jig. It's got a big 5/0 hook, 20-pound line, you know, so 1/2 ounce around the boat docks, 5/8 out deeper around really heavy cover, you know, big rocks, trees, brush piles, things like that. You know, that 5/8 a little bit lighter is going to hang up a little less. And then when you really want to fish deep, drop it off of a steep ledge, maybe fishing bluffs, things like that, where you want to get that fast fall, or even real heavy current situations. You know, like we were talking about fishing up towards Truman Dam, that current's going to be really swift. So, you know, you're going to have to bump up that jig size to a 3/4 ounce so you get that straight fall, so it's not washing down the bank, you know. But we're adjusting the fall rate on those, and then the trailer selection is pretty simple. Lately, I've just been throwing a twin tail grub because I have a lot of them. You know, just a 5-inch twin tail grub, something with a lot of action when it's falling is what I've been using. So it could be this twin tail, it could be you know, a creature bait with some tentacles on it, it could be a big flapping crawdad, something with some movement, something with a lot of action. Is what I'm using right now. You know, when we get earlier in the spring, you know, I'll tend to use something with a lot less action. But when this water's warm, you know, we're using something that moves a lot, has some vibration, something that attracts fish to it. You know, like in the spring, I'm using something like that, which really doesn't have a whole lot of action, but very subtle. You know, those fish are lethargic, and that little bait, it looks stupid, but it's pretty deadly. You know, I mean, it doesn't do a whole lot on a jig, but it looks like a crawdad, and you know, that we're still using that. You know, maybe around shallow boat docks and things like that, but typically using something with a lot more action to it. Around the fish that, you know, maybe be suspended around boat docks related to shad, using that swim jig a lot. I'm using a 1/2 ounce swim jig, something that's a little bit heavier. That way I can fish it in a variety of conditions. You know, whether I see them suspended underneath the boat dock, chasing shad, I can burn that down the boat dock, and a lot of times they'll react to it. Or, you know, if they're suspended out on a point, or, you know, around brush, things like that, you got a good weed guard on it, and I can let that thing sink down there, and it has a big profile, and I can just fish it through there real slow. So you can experiment with retrieves. We were catching a lot of fish in Truman around the bushes on this. Last couple weeks we were using a bluegill color though. I caught some on the white down there. Wasn't seeing the shad spawn like I wanted to. Started seeing a lot of brim beds. Started seeing a lot of fish protect and fry. And what really clued me into throwing the swim jig, so I usually have one tied on, and you can also fish this pro jig the exact same way, which is really efficient. You know, you got two baits in one. You got a swim jig and you got a bait you can fish on the bottom, all in one right there. You don't have to switch rods. So if you can get away with that, it's a really, really fun way to fish. So that's kind of what I was doing at Truman. We're flipping bushes. I'm getting a few bites in the bushes, but when I'm reeling it in, fish are chasing it and they're eating it. So I said to myself, well, why am I spending all this time letting my bait fall to the bottom when I can just reel it around and catch them? So, of course, started doing that, started seeing a lot of bluegill, a lot of fry, and that bite was phenomenal. Well, that bite changed 2 or 3 days later. You know, they started getting in the green bushes, then they moved to willow trees, then they moved to points. So it's a constant progression of these fish, and you just kind of have to take those little clues that you get throughout the day. If I'm reeling a jig in and one eats it, you know, it's probably not a coincidence. If it happens twice, it's definitely not a fluke. So, you know, I'm going to throw out there at that point, maybe reel my jig a little bit, maybe fish a little faster on the bottom, maybe throw a swim bait, maybe throw a crankbait, something that's moving. So I'm going to try to take those clues to where I can be a little bit more efficient throughout the day. If I'm dragging a jig around on the bottom, it takes more time than throwing a crankbait out there or reeling one around, you know, reeling a jig around even through the middle of the water column. I've had it happen where, you know, that's actually a good way to catch them, surprisingly. The shaky head's been really, really effective. You know, 5/16 quarter ounce, like I said, around boat docks, shallower cover. And then when we're moving out deeper, I'm using the Trophy Bass Company mag shaky head. It's got a bigger hook in it where you can use a bigger worm. It's got kind of a straight shake hook in here, which I like. It comes through their mouth easier. It seems to me it gets a little bit better hooking power. But this bait will fish really good through brush. It'll stand up on the bottom. And the shaky head just gets bites. You know, it's a finesse presentation. Now this is a big worm, so it's a little bit less of a finesse presentation than what probably a lot of people are thinking, but on this lake, you know, this is pretty finessey right here, and it gets a lot of bites. So using the Zoom Magnum trick worm a lot. I like this Mag Finake worm from Bass Pro. It's a little bit smaller, it's a little bit softer, but it's still got that big profile. But it kind of has a cupped tail. It has a unique action, and what I like about it is it's really, really soft, and it's inexpensive. So I go through quite a bit of them, but on our guide trips and things where, you know, maybe the guys haven't set the hook a lot, which is half the battle when you're beginning to fish, is kind of realizing the bite, taking the slack out of your line, and getting a good hook set to where you don't lose a lot of those fish. Because, you know, when we're on a guide trip, well, we want to get them in the boat, you know, we want to take pictures of them, and everybody wants to have fun, so it's always heartbreaking to watch that fish get away. So this worm being a little bit softer, it seems like I catch a few bit more of them, especially, you know, when using a spinning rod and things like that. So that's been a really good one for me. But, you know, really the Cinco or, you know, Bass Pro Sticko works well. And this is black in color. I know we got pretty clear water down here right now, so we're, you know, using a lot of, you know, this natural looking stuff like this, green pumpkins, watermelons. But low light conditions, you know, when you get around darker water, but like usually in the mornings or at night, you know, I start off with something a little bit darker in color. It gets a little bit more visibility to it, I think. I think those fish can see it a little bit better. So I may only throw that for an hour or two in the morning, or that black and blue jig, and before I switch. But in those low light conditions, you know, I tend to throw a darker bait, and especially, you know, at night, you know, always got a dark colored bait on. So, but during the daylight hours, you know, and in the clear water, which I've seen a lot of, most of the lake, we're going to use, you know, just more of these natural colors. It really doesn't matter what kind of flake you have in there. Purple's always good, you know, blue's always good, but you know, whatever you have confidence in, that's what I'm going to suggest you throw. Fish are getting suspended a lot, so this is a cool little bait that we throw a lot on our guide trips because it's easy to hook them. And you can see this one's got the line still tied to it. I just took it off a pole in my garage before I came over here, but this is our wacky weight right here from Trophy Bass Company. It's just a simple little lead weight. It's got a small bevel on there, and that bevel kind of increases the action on this. But what we're doing with this wacky weight, when they get suspended, when we've caught a few of them, when these fish are around deeper boat docks, and you just want to get, or even when we're fishing that wacky rig shallow, you get windy conditions and things like that. It's blowing a little bit of loop in your line. You know, you're not getting a tight line where you can feel those bites because oftentimes they're very subtle. We're putting that wacky weight on there. And so we're going to put the flat side towards the worm. And really it doesn't matter, but I like the flat side towards the worm because it stays a little bit more uniform and flusher against the worm. But what that wacky worm does, it has a little hole in it, in that wacky weight, and you just slide whatever hook you want in there. And that's my favorite part. So you can use a weedless hook, I can use 20-pound line, and that's what I use this application for a lot. So I like fishing a bait caster, and so typically I'll throw this on a bait caster. And when I go to a lake like this that has a lot of 5-pounders in it, a lot of times those little wacky rig hooks, and 8-pound line just don't cut it for me. Especially if you're going to fish it around heavy cover. So what I'll do is I'll take this and put the wacky weight on here, and that heavier line, if it was weightless, is going to really slow that fall, and make it a lot more ineffective. It's going to make it harder for me to cast it. So now I can use a bigger rod, I can use bigger line, and I can use the hook of my choice. And so that's what I really like about it. And what I often use, this right here is a 2/0 Hayabusa trailer hook actually. And it's got a little bit bigger eyelet to it, which actually helps on this wacky weight, because when you hook a fish, a lot of times that is going to slide up there. And if you got a real small hook on there, it's going to want to shake off the end or slide up your line, which I don't like. Or if you're trying to skip it, to slide up your line. So I try to use a little bit heavier hook as opposed to like your regular wacky rig hook, where it has a bigger eyelet where that weight doesn't want to slide off of there. But that's really, really effective on suspended fish. So when the current's a little bit slower, or maybe I've caught a few and they get up off the bottom, I'll throw it out there, basically just hold that thing. And it's actually really great around bluffs. We throw it a lot around the bluffs where they kind of hang vertical. It just kind of falls slow around them. But using that a lot, has great hooking power, so it's really good for the guide trips. Those fish.
Who makes those weights?
That's actually our Trophy Bass Company weight. So it's called a wacky weight. I got some cards here I'll give you guys. It's got a little promo code on the back where you can save a little money on some website orders. But it's super inexpensive. So if a lot of times the actual worm itself. And if you use, I don't typically use a O-ring like a lot of people do. I think it kind of offsets the way the worm sits on there, so I feel like it makes it fall a little funky. So I just rig it right there through the middle. That's what's going to keep that hook or that weight from sliding off. You'll throw a worm occasionally, it'll lose a weight or two, but it stays on there pretty good. They come in packs of I think a dozen, so and pretty inexpensive. So if you throw one off, we try to give you enough where it won't upset you too bad. But
What size is that?
this right here, I believe, is a 3/32. So and that's the one I throw the most. It's probably 3/32. We throw an 1/8 a little bit too, which is a little bit bigger. But that 3/32 gets down there pretty good, especially on a spinning rod. That eighth I'll throw, on the bait caster typically.
Awesome on wave breaks too.
It is really good around the wave breaks. It gets down there and it just falls, and your line gets tight and he's on there. And then, the other part, when you get around some of that stuff, the part I like about like a straight shank hook like this is oftentimes, you know, I'll use the exposed hook like that. But you can also, you know, take this and rig it up where you can make it weedless. So what I'll do is I'll slide it on there, then I'll take my wacky rig, put it on there, and then I'll just rotate that hook. Okay, and so now it falls weightless. My hook point is inside of that worm, and so it keeps it falling straight with that worm down there. So you get that same action. You can use that big hook right there. But now when I'm fishing, let's say around cables, around brush piles, stuff like that, I'll just tuck it back in there, as opposed to using, you know, one of those weed guards or something like that. I can use the same worm, just grab it, you know, rotate that worm around, and you know, it's a really efficient way to fish, and it catches a lot of them. So, but you know, we're throwing a lot of that stuff. I didn't bring, you know, deep crankbait right now is a fun way to fish. It's a running current. You know, deep crankbait's a good way to go. You know, I throw a variety of types and sizes. You know, Lucky Strike Deep Smoothie is one I throw a lot. Strike King products are all real good, whether it's a 5XD, 6XD, 10XD. Those are all pretty good. Typically though, I won a Bassmaster Open table rock on a Strike King a long time ago, 6XD, but you know, it's a great bait, catches a ton of fish, but it's hard to fish around a lot of brush cover. So definitely have a plug knocker with you, because you will go through some. The DD22 is good around brush cover. You know, doesn't get as deep typically as some of the other ones, but it bounces off the cover real good. I like a Norman deep little end. You know, it's similar to the DD22. Doesn't go very deep, but it bounces off cover really good. Been throwing the 6th Sense stuff last couple of years. They make, I don't even know if they make the one I really like anymore. It's like a 3 and a 500 DD. It's really, really good bait. Thrown some of their other ones. I can't remember some of the other models, but you know, Cloud crankbait. Yeah, I think it's that Cloud 9 maybe. But yeah, you know, there's a variety of crankbaits, shad colors, blueback chartreuse, you know, sexy shad. Keep it pretty simple. You know, you get your cloudy days, dirty water, brighter colors. You know, real bright days, not a lot of clouds. You're going to throw more translucent baits, more of your white baits, something a little bit more natural. So just keep it simple.
Yeah. Why don't you talk about the speed in your line and stuff like that?
For a crankbait?
Yeah, right. The crankbait, you know, there's a lot of different speeds,
Sure.
a lot of different line sizes, and a lot of depths that you can.
Yeah. So you know, I typically throw a 12-pound line on, you know, all my crankbaits almost. Besides, you know, besides like a square bill, I usually throw a little bit heavier line. But yeah, typically 12-pound line. You know, if I'm fishing a real big bait, a real big heavy bait, I'll throw, you know, 15. You know, something that is going to have less shock, basically, so I don't throw it off at the end of the cast. But I'm going to check my line a lot because you want your bait hitting the bottom. You want to deflect it off cover. That's typically what generates strikes. So I'm going to use whatever bait. You know, I've had experience with a lot of the baits that I've mentioned, so I kind of know how deep they run. So you want to play with those baits, and once you kind of figure out how deep that bait will actually go, you know, crankbait fishing is kind of unique in that, you know, when I'm really going to throw a crankbait, I have a lot of them tied on, it seems like, because each of them, it's like a different tool for the job. If I'm fishing a point in 18 foot of water, and that bait's only diving 16 foot, and those fish are set up in 18, it's really not that effective. So I'm going to have maybe a bait that I can throw in 12 to 16 foot, and then a bait that I can throw in 18 to 25, and I'll use those different baits maybe in different situations just so I can get the bait down there. I use a big rod so I can get long cast. The longer the cast, the more time it has to get to that achieved depth. So, you know, when you're throwing a big crankbait, you know, it's going like this. So it's making, you know, like a U shape back to the boat. So there's only going to be a short amount of time where it's got that maximum depth that it's hitting. So the further you can throw it, the longer time it spends on the bottom and the more effective each one of your casts is going to be. So I'll use a rod that's, you know, usually 7'10", so I'm using like a 7'10", medium heavy. You know, those big plugs have pretty big hooks in them. You know, I mean, it's not your traditional thin wire treble hook that you're seeing on a jerk bait where you're using a medium action rod. You know, it's a pretty big hook. I don't know what gauge they are, but it's big enough where I use a medium heavy to almost heavy action rod. Now it's parabolic, it's a cranking rod, so it has some good bend to it, but you know, it's pretty substantial. So you can you want to have quite a bit of tip so you can get that whipping action and throw that bait out there, and you know, and have some forgiveness on the jumps. But you also want to have something to drive the hook home a little bit too. You know, you're dealing with you know, typically crankbait catches big ones. You know, not just here, but you know, a lot of the places we go during the summertime, it may not be the one that catches the most fish, but it typically, you know, those moving baits are going to pick off big aggressive fish a lot of times. You know, bigger rod, and then I'm using, you know, I try not to get too many gear ratios going on my reels, because I want to know exactly what you know, my baits feel like. So, you know, on my bottom baits, I'm always using a high-speed gear ratio, you know, 7:5 to 1 or better, where you can take up a lot of line really fast. On a deep diving crankbait, that tends to wear you out a little bit, and it'll wear your reel down a little bit too. It just, you know, it's just hard on it. So in that instance, I tend to use more like a 6:3 to 1, 6:8 to 1, something a little bit slower. But I want to have something where if a fish is running to the side, where I hook him a long ways out, I can still gain control over that fish. So like a 5-1 to 1 or something real slow like that. Although it's easier on me to get it down there, you know, I'm winding it a lot, which is, you know, sometimes in itself will wear you out. But if I need to catch up to a fish and I've thrown it half a mile out there, I want to be able to do so. So I would still like to keep it in that, you know, 6:3 to 6:8 to 1 gear ratio in case I can need to pick up some line on him. And I'll throw typically, you know, a pretty wide spool. So this is a Johnny Moore's Signature Series from Bass Pro Shops, and it holds a lot of line. And so that's really important when you're making long casts. You want to, and when you're using big line. So I use a lot of 20-pound line, and if I'm trying to make a long cast with big line, you know, I'll throw half of the line out of that spool because of the diameter of that line. You know, so and then when you do that, your gear ratio is less. Okay, so your spool is smaller, so each wind is a little bit less effective. The fuller your spool is, the more you're going to get the most out of each retrieve, as far as, you know, how much line it takes up. So it's going to, as you get down in the spool, it's going to take up less line per crank of the handle. So really large spool size, and you know, just typically fish that bait pretty fast to the boat. I like to fish a crankbait you know, pretty fast most of the time. Now once I start grinding the bottom with it, you know, I'll slow it down a little bit to just try to keep it from getting hung up. Or if I can feel it, a lot of times you can kind of feel it coming up a piece of brush, you know that your line will be actually draped over the brush, and you can feel it kind of climbing up, you know, once you get a good sense of what your bait's doing. And at that point, I'll kind of slow it down a little bit to keep it out of the brush. Yeah, get the plug knocker ready, exactly. But you know, it's it's just one of those deals where you have to experiment with retrieves.
Use a fluorocarbon or mono on your crankbait?
That's a good question. I use fluorocarbon on the deep crankbaits because I think it helps get the bait down there. Now, the shallow crankbaits, I kind of go back and forth a little bit. I use fluorocarbon, 17-pound Bass Pro Shops fluorocarbon most of the time. That's a good, size for me on the square bill. Usually I'm fishing it around pretty heavy cover. Usually fishing it not that far underneath the surface. So that's a good line size and been good to me. But if the fish are getting the back hook, and I'm losing a few of them, sometimes I switch to mono just to see if it makes a difference. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's a color change that's needed. But if the fish aren't getting the bait, it's good. And then sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. A lot of times it's conditions. I'm getting bites on a crankbait, but it's slick, bluebird, and no wind. It's maybe not the best time to throw one, so they're not going to get the bait as deep. But I'll definitely, the smaller the line size, the deeper your bait's going to go typically. But 12-pound for those deep baits is a good, good all-around size. Throw it on my wiggle works a lot too, just because I like them a lot and I don't want to lose them. I probably would throw them on 8 to get them down there more, but I just like them 2 bites. I'm too disappointed when I lose one. But so 12-pound is pretty much where I go with the crankbait. But you can get really creative. I've been throwing the 3/4 ounce Trophy Bass Company spinnerbait out there a lot. Been putting a trailer on it usually, something like a fluke. Sometimes a swim bait, but really I don't throw a swim bait too much on it because it kind of creates some lift. So if I want to throw this out deep, I'm sinking it to the bottom, and that swim bait having a paddle tail is going to make that bait kind of swim further up off the bottom. So I'm going to typically use maybe a grub or something with a little less lift. But that fluke seems to be pretty good. It's heavy, kind of has a little bit of action to it, but just gives it a little bit more presence, a little bit more profile, and a lot of times they'll slack it on the fall. I'll throw it out there, and it's just going down, and your line will just jump. So, but you're just same way you fish a spinnerbait anywhere else. You throw it out there and reel it in. You're just bumping the cover with it. The only difference is you're just going to have to wait on it to sink. And just like your jig or anything else, let that thing go to the bottom and then start winding it in. When you lose contact with the bottom, let it flutter back down a little bit. But you can get real erratic with this. Pretty fun way to fish. You catch a lot of wipers. You catch white bass. You have a lot of them knock it and miss it, but you can get as creative as you want this time of year. Like I said, it's a fun time of year to go out and experiment with stuff. Me and John went out the other day and we're throwing a rig that's kind of new to us. It's a little Tokyo rig deal, and we went out there and we caught fish on it and caught a couple nice ones. So it's just a deal where it's easy to use, and you can just catch fish on just about anything if you put your mind to it this time of year. So what else are we doing right now? Go ahead, Bob.
Question for you. We got a few minutes. Appreciate your time. I kind of want to go back to something you were talking about earlier. So this time of year, we have a lot of people coming down on weekends and fishing. Got the big boat traffic. Kind of want to stay in their coves a little bit, or side pockets in their coves where they're not getting beat up by the waves. You talked a little bit about the swim jig. What other type of things would you, what would you recommend they look, what type of baits or what type of things would you consider in terms of fishing around docks and stuff like that?
Sure.
Not everybody's real proficient at skipping behind docks or want to take the time.
Right.
What kind of things would you recommend? Is there anything in terms of what they might visually see behind the dock in terms of size of rocks or anything like that that you would recommend?
Yeah, so any kind of cover behind boat docks is good, or beside them. If you see brush sticking up, that's great. The concrete pylons behind the docks, especially if you get some higher water where you actually have some water on those, 3 or 4 feet, that's really good. Whether it's concrete or metal, they like something behind there. Look for sea-doo lifts. you know, just a little bit of added extra shade. You know, really, even the floats that hold up the cables, you know, a lot of times they'll sit underneath those. So any kind of visible cover back behind there is what I'm looking for. You know, take into mind that the fish are finishing up spawning, so they're spawning on kind of flatter stuff. And so now they're kind of moving out, water's getting warmer, so a lot of times, and they're running current, so we have fluctuating water, you know, day to day. So they'll tend to kind of get on some of those little bit steeper banks, you know. So I would suggest fishing something with a little bit more gradual, or a little bit more of a slope to it as opposed to that real gradual taper. You know, you'll have more depth, especially behind the docks in some of those areas. So, you know, if you're fishing in your cove, you're fishing on the weekend, you know, hit all the little points in your cove, you know, go back there, look for shad, you know, always look for the activity of bait fish and bluegill. So if you see bait fish and bluegill, you know, suspended in the pockets or, you know, on the surface, you know, maybe throw a topwater, things like that. A lot of times you'll be getting out there early in the morning, so get out there on an open bank or throw towards the corner of these boat docks with, you know, a spook. A pop-R is really good. So a spook takes some cadence, you know, it takes a little bit of time to be able to, you know, walk it around. So a lot of times on our guide trips, I have them throw a pop-R, which is pretty easy. You know, you throw it out there, stays on the surface, and you just kind of chug it along. So, you know, slow is usually good. You can, you know, go as slow as steady as you want or make it as erratic as you want. You can impart the action on that bait, and there's really no wrong way to do it. But typically, you know, give it a few pops, let it sit, give it a few pops, let it sit. That's really good in the backs of coves, around bluegill beds, you know, any kind of open bank that you have with bigger rock, look for shade. So you can get out in any cove and do that early in the morning. And the good part about this lake is any cove that you're in, you're going to be around fish. So you don't have to run 100 miles to go be around a bass. They're living in your cove. They're probably underneath your boat dock. So, you know, finesse worm is a real staple, especially on our guide trips. It's easy to throw. They hold on to it for a long time. So whether you're in a bass boat, a kayak, whatever, you can fish slow, drag this thing around, and get some bites. So I'm going to say, you know, the shaky head, you know, if you're going out here on the weekend, the shaky head, the wacky rig, with or without the Trophy Bass Company wacky weight, they're both really effective. You know, if you're using bait casting gear, I'm going to suggest a jig and some of these, you know, larger profile baits, you know, your bigger shaky heads, things like that. They tend to catch big fish, but I'm surprised every day on the guide trips, whether it's a Ned rig, a shaky head, a 4-inch finesse worm, you know, big fish will eat anything. So we've been catching actually a lot of fish on the Ned rig. That's been kind of fun. That's great for a beginner. If you don't know what a Ned rig is, it's, you know, this right here. You know, like half or a quarter of your Cinco on a small jig head. And, you know, really I use this worm a lot. What I'll do is, you know, we'll have customers use these worms all day long. They get tore up, and usually they're tore up right here on the head of the bait. And I'll pinch that tail off, thread it on the worm. It's cheap, it's easy, and, you know, if you get around them, they're not that picky. I mean, look at this thing. It doesn't look like a whole lot, and they're eating it. And it'll catch, you know, it'll catch them all shapes and sizes from 6 inches to 6 pounds to catfish to bluegill. So fun way to fish. Kids love it. You know, it has a whole cult following of people that throw only this bait. So pretty cool little bait. Get some bites. You know, and of course, you know, if you're fishing here on the weekend, it's going to be really rough. It's going to be hard to get out there on that main lake. You got a small boat, and it's after 10 o'clock. Probably wouldn't recommend it. So, you know, stay in the coves, fish the points, fish those bigger boat docks, and just kind of, you know, mill around and try to figure out what they're doing. Are they in front of the docks? Are they behind the docks? Are they using the brush piles? If you don't have a depth finder, I'm going to use something like this mag shaky head here, something that's weedless, that's heavy, where you can kind of feel the bottom, feel the cover, you know, and it'll get down there, get some bites for you, but it'll help you kind of understand what's on the bottom. You know, it'll get in those brush piles, it'll get around those bigger rocks, it'll help you kind of telegraph what's out there. So, you know, if you don't have the greatest electronics or you're fishing out of a kayak or paddle boat or whatever, you know, I mean, you can get out there and throw some of this heavier stuff around. It gets to the bottom a little bit faster, and it's just going to help you learn what's down there. So the shaky head, the finesse worms. You know, if it was me, I'm using bait casting gear. I'm gonna start with that jig, or maybe a big crankbait. You know, those big crankbaits, these big jigs. They're just a little bit harder to throw on the spinning gear. So you know, and then on the bait casting gear, and on all of the rods that you're using, I'm going to recommend using as long of a rod as you feel comfortable with. You know, a taller guy's probably going to feel more comfortable with a longer rod, but I know a shorter rod's a lot easier to use around maybe boat docks, or you know, when you're tight to cover, or casting underneath docks and things like that. But you know, when you're throwing a lot of line off your reel, when you're fishing deep, when you're fishing around heavy cover or underneath boat docks, man, a lot of times it really pays to have that 7'6", you know, 7 foot and above. But I pretty much use a 7'6", 7'4", something that when I set the hook, I'm moving a lot of line, taking up a lot of slack out of the line, and I'm able to move that fish from the cover. So, you know, I'm pretty much using a 7'6" heavy action rod on most of the bottom baits I'm using right now. Whether that's flipping to a boat dock, or you know, throwing a jig out in 20 foot of water, I'm pretty much using the same rod for a lot of those techniques, and it's gonna be a lot more forgiving. You know, if I have a 6'6" rod and I have a ton of line out, and I'm making this big long, you know, hook set like that, I mean, I'm pulling 8 more feet of slack out of the line, you know, with that bigger rod. So it just helps you, you know, especially when the fish are eating the bait real soft, which they're doing right now. I would recommend fluorocarbon line. If you're using a spinning rod, we use braid to fluorocarbon. You can just telegraph those bites better. You get better hook sets. You're going to feel the bottom better. But really light bite right now. You got to be a line watcher. You got to be paying attention, and you got to be kind of, you know, knowing what your bait feels like when it's on the bottom. That's why some of those heavier weights help. You know, it's not only is it more efficient, not only does it get to the bottom faster, but you know, it's going to help you kind of telegraph that bite. If you're bumping the bottom, bumping the bottom, bumping the bottom, all of a sudden it's kind of mushy on you, and probably fish on it. You know, so you know, hook sets are free, so you might as well check that fish and give a good swing on them. But
Any other questions, guys?
You're leaving for a tournament soon?
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to leave probably Thursday for Lake Chickamauga in Tennessee. You know, so it's a good lake, small lake. Going to be a lot of guys, so it'll be a fishery where it'll be really similar to here. We have variety of cover, a lot of current, got boat docks, brush piles, ledges, grass. So it's you know, it's gonna be one of those deals where you're gonna kind of try to have to figure out. And so this lake's 100 miles long. You know, this Lake Chickamauga is gonna be, you know, there's a lot less spots for them to get. So it's gonna be a deal where a guy's got to kind of figure out something a little bit special to where he's not having to fish around 8 or 9 boats when he shows up the first day of the tournament. So it'll be a challenging tournament for sure. So
One thing is, good luck, bud.
thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah, when's the actual tournament start?
So I changed it a little bit. So we usually start on Thursday. So our first day of practice will be Saturday, and we'll practice Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and we'll start the tournament on Tuesday this time. So
And we'll be able to watch that on FLW Live.
I assume that it'll be
They are.
on the FLW Live, just like always. So I know we may, you know, with everything going on right now, we may have some increased coverage in other places. I'm not sure, but it'll be fun to watch. It's going to be the first tournament of this format ever. So we've had 3 of our regular season events, and you know, now they're going to call them super tournaments. So we're going to complete our season. They've changed the schedule a little bit, but they've invited the MLF Pro Tour guys to come fish. You know, because of some cancellation of some other tournaments. So there's going to be some new faces. There's going to be, you know, probably a bigger pro field than we've seen in the last, you know, 8 or 9 years for sure. So, you know, FLW, we've always had pretty big fields, but this one's going to be, I believe, over 200 boats, and so our remaining 3 events we'll fish with those guys fishing with us. So
What is the format?
It'll be the same 5-fish format. You know, we're still fishing for our points and our championship, whereas they're just fishing for you know, prize money basically, since they've got their other circuit. The payouts have increased pretty substantially, so it'll be more lucrative, and I anticipate, you know, with more anglers and things like that, and some of the less tournaments, we'll probably have some different coverage and increased coverage available. So it'll, I'm not really 100% sure what we're going to see, but the fish catching format's going to be the same.
Just gonna be catch.
It'll be, it won't be a pro-am, so it's still going to be with the marshals, and I believe, you know, and I don't know that we'll have marshals either with the, you know, everything going on. They might deem it safer to
You're actually gonna weigh them in though? You're gonna
we'll weigh our 5 in on stage. I don't know if they'll do drive-through weigh-ins or what they'll do, but you know, usually, so we had our last tournament right when this COVID was hitting. We were in Alabama, or COVID. So right when this was hitting, you know, we kind of had our deal going on in Alabama, and it was just, you know, they were on the verge of kind of canceling it. But we kind of, for that tournament, we did away with the marshals. We did away with our meetings, so we wouldn't have, you know, people gathering around. And then, you know, we just had, you know, people would drop the bags off to us instead of waiting in a bag line, and they separated the people at the tank a little bit more. So we had one person at each tank. So you know, you'll see some of those same guidelines, I'm sure, but it's going to be pretty much business as usual. Weigh in 5 fish, and you know, they'll make a cut after 2 days and a cut after the 3rd day. So I think the cuts are the same. I'm not sure. They may have increased some of the guys with the that make each cut. You know, we usually do, I think we're doing a top 20 cut now. We used to do a 30 cut. So you can tell how much I know. I just go fishing.
You just go there.
I just show up
You're gonna
usually.
get a cut, right?
So, yeah, so it'll be exciting. I'm looking forward to it. A lot of those guys I've fished against, you know, most of my career, and not so much the last couple years. So it'll be exciting to see some of those guys again and hang out and fish against them. So it'll be different. That's for sure.
Any other questions for Casey? Casey, thank you very much, man.
Appreciate it.
We really appreciate you being here. Thank you.